Introducing the Republic of Nauru, a small island nation with a land area of only 8 square miles and a population of just under 11,000 people, making it the third smallest country globally after Vatican City and Monaco. In 1789, British explorers discovered Nauru, which was covered in lush vegetation with a green central plateau, swaying palms, and white sand beaches. The island's beauty led to its nickname, Pleasant Island. Several decades later, the first non-native inhabitants settled on Nauru, which is approximately 1/3 the size of Manhattan. At first, it was believed that Nauru's resources were limited to coconuts and pigs until a British geologist discovered a significant deposit of high-quality phosphate ore. Rather than discovering oil, the scientists found a valuable resource in the form of fossilized bird droppings and algae. This resource was highly prized for its use in fertilizers, as well as cosmetics and animal feed. During the turn of the 20th century, when the discovery was made, 80% of Pleasant Island was found to be rich in this mineral. It was a valuable deposit of accumulated seabird excrement combined with marine microorganisms, which had remained undiscovered until that time. Although it may sound repulsive, this discovery was vital in feeding a rapidly growing global population, making it an incredibly valuable resource. Once the discovery was made, mining rights were promptly sold to Germany, which was the colonial power in Nauru at the time. As a result, shipping ports, processing facilities, and supporting industries quickly emerged on the small island, which exported approximately 80 million metric tons of this valuable substance over the following years. However, Germany's involvement in World War I led to Australia taking control of Nauru, seizing the opportunity to claim the island for itself. This occurred even as industries and facilities continued to flourish on the tiny island, which was scarcely larger than Central Park. At this particular juncture, the island had transformed into an offshore mining location. Phosphate was primarily distributed to farmers in Australia, New Zealand, and Great Britain at a discounted rate, known colloquially in Australia as mates rates. Regrettably, several decades of mining had already caused extensive damage to Nauru's natural environment. National Geographic at the time described the island's upper section as a ghastly tract of land, which was a stark contrast to its previous identity as Pleasant Island. The situation only deteriorated from this point onwards. During the course of World War I, Japan invaded Nauru and inflicted terror on the island's inhabitants, including forced labor camps and mass drownings. Following the end of the war, only 600 Naurusians survived. Once Japan surrendered, control of the island reverted back to the Australians, who resumed their exploitation of Nauru's resources. Between 1945 and 1968, phosphate mining activities reached unprecedented levels. When Nauru finally attained independence, there was no external force mandating phosphate mining, but by then, the entire economy was heavily reliant on exporting this natural resource. At the time of Nauru's independence, 1/3 of its islands had already been consumed by mining activities. As a result, the inhabitants were forced to reside in a desolate, moon-like environment that had become even more unattractive over time. Every economy is constrained by the factors of production, which include land, labor, and capital. However, in the case of Nauru, these constraints were exceedingly severe. The island's population was small and lacked diverse skill sets, as their main area of expertise was limited to extracting rocks from the ground. Due to the small size of their country and its remote location, a number of industries were not viable. Although the extraction of phosphorus has brought significant profits to the island, the majority of these funds had already been appropriated by the nations that had colonized it. Lacking the necessary infrastructure and knowledge to develop alternative industries, the only feasible option was to continue to exploit the phosphate reserves as long as possible. Unfortunately, there was little prospect of being able to compete with other industries. Although it was clear that the phosphate supply would be depleted within a generation or two, the Naurusians persisted in their rightful pursuit of a fair share. This marked a significant era in the history of Nauru, which some have dubbed the wealthiest small island in the Pacific. Just over a decade after gaining independence, Nauru achieved worldwide recognition as the wealthiest nation in the world on a per capita basis. In 1981, its GDP per capita stood at $27,000, which, adjusted for inflation, amounts to $88,000 in today's currency. By way of comparison, the US GDP per capita was $14,000 at the time, implying that the typical Nauruan was twice as affluent as the average American. While GDP per capita is an imperfect indicator of a nation's prosperity, it remains the most convenient measure for cross-country comparisons, providing us with at least a rough estimate of living standards. Nauru was thriving thanks to its plentiful phosphate reserves and newfound political autonomy. Following the advice often given to athletes to retire at the height of their success, many Nauruans decided to call it quits while they were ahead. This was due, in part, to the generous government provisions of free healthcare and education, as well as the ongoing royalties paid out to landowners from the profits of the phosphate industry. As a result, a significant number of residents had the luxury of choosing not to work. During this period, Nauru was also the setting for a host of peculiar incidents. Despite its diminutive size, sports cars became a must-have status symbol among the locals. However, given the island's compact circumference, it was hardly an ideal location for drag racing, and one could leisurely circle it in just an hour. One police chief went so far as to import a Lamborghini, only to discover that he could not fit behind the wheel. This incident, along with others, was indicative of a looming health crisis that was about to hit the island. In 1980, an epidemiologist proclaimed that Nauru was in the grip of an obesity epidemic, fueled by rising affluence and unhealthy dietary habits. The consumption of junk food skyrocketed, and by 2002, the nation was ranked by the World Health Organization as the worst of 170 countries in terms of average body mass index. Consequently, the life expectancy of a Nauruan was only marginally above 60 years. The traditional native fare, such as fish and coconuts, had given way to imported foods, a consequence of the mining industry's impact. The health crisis in Nauru has not only impacted individuals, but also had significant economic ramifications. The inability to drive a Lamborghini pales in comparison to the overall implications of the obesity epidemic. To fully comprehend the gravity of the situation, it's worth delving deeper into Nauru's current health status. Even today, the typical diet consists mainly of instant noodles, canned food, white rice, and sugary drinks. Binge drinking and tobacco use are also prevalent. It's worth noting that Nauruans are highly educated and well-informed about the perils of unhealthy eating habits and obesity. The issue is not a lack of education or awareness programs, but rather the absence of access to healthy, high-quality food. Decades of phosphate mining have ravaged the island's natural environment, leaving the agricultural sector in shambles. As a result, the economic downturn that followed the depletion of phosphate reserves meant that most Nauruans could only afford inexpensive processed foods. In the colonial era, the Nauruan people only received a tiny percentage of the riches generated by the phosphate mining industry. Against this backdrop, economic necessity rather than greed prompted them to continue mining after achieving independence. Importing all essential goods, including food and water, is not a viable way of life. With all the focus on phosphate mining, there was little interest in manufacturing or agriculture. Besides, the land was too depleted to support agriculture anyway, as the topsoil had been removed for mining purposes. The situation appears to be a textbook example of the Dutch disease, but with a much more severe impact, considering the Naurusian economy's otherwise restricted resources. To mitigate this, one potential solution is to diversify the economy, a tactic that certain Middle Eastern countries have implemented with great effort. Although the success of these initiatives remain a topic of intense discussion, their efforts are commendable. The Naurusian leaders were well aware of the need for diversification and had made attempts to venture into various industries. One such industry was offshore banking, which resulted in licenses being granted to approximately 400 foreign banks in the early 1990s. These Naurusian bank branches initially proved to be highly profitable, albeit though a rather dubious strategy. It was not necessary for customers to visit the island to open a bank account, and through so-called economic citizenship, one could easily obtain a Naurusian passport, which effectively turned the country into a haven for money laundering and tax evasion. The government earned millions in fees, but this was not a viable long-term solution to address the economic challenges faced by Nauru after the depletion of its phosphate reserves. In 2005, Nauru ceased its offshore banking operations and implemented new regulations that mandated a physical presence in order to obtain a bank license. This decision was not a voluntary one, but was rather a result of intense international pressure. The United States even went as far as categorizing Nauru as a rogue state under the 2001 Patriot Act, which played a significant role in prompting the change. An alternative method to address the issue of Dutch disease is to adopt the Norwegian model, which involves creating a sovereign wealth fund that can strategically invest the profits generated from natural resources to secure long-term dividends for future generations. In the case of Nauru, a considerable portion of the profits from the phosphate boom was invested overseas with the intention of providing for the future when the resources would be depleted. However, the implementation of this idea was marred by mismanagement, risky ventures, and fraudulent activities, causing substantial losses and ultimately pushing the country to the brink of insolvency. Despite the discovery of secondary phosphate deposits and the ensuing second phosphate rush, the prospect of an economic collapse continued to loom over Nauru. The situation deteriorated to such an extent that even the central bank of the country went bankrupt, and their real estate holdings abroad were seized. Furthermore, Nauru's national airline, which had been established in the 1970s, was not spared from the crisis and suffered losses. Ultimately, the country faced a dire financial situation that seemed almost irreparable. Despite the country's financial woes, Nauru made one final attempt to secure its economic future through a risky investment in the London theatre scene. In a move that would later become infamous, Nauru invested in the production of Leonardo the Musical, A Portrait of Love, a show that depicted a love triangle involving Leonardo da Vinci, Mona Lisa, and a soldier. Unfortunately, the musical proved to be a colossal failure and incurred significant financial losses for Nauru at a time when it could least afford them. By 2001, Nauru had depleted all of its phosphate reserves and experienced a string of unsuccessful foreign investments. The country was left financially destitute, with a meager GDP of $32 million when adjusted for inflation, and an unemployment rate that skyrocketed to 90%. The education system, which had once been a source of pride for Nauru, suffered significant setbacks as well. It is worth noting that just a few years prior, Nauru was considered the wealthiest nation globally. Unfortunately, this marked only the beginning of a bleak era for the country, as the economic downturn had far-reaching and devastating consequences. In 2001, the Norwegian freighter MV Tampa encountered a predicament when it sought to dock in Australia after rescuing over 400 refugees, mostly Afghans, from a sinking vessel. However, Australia denied the ship entry into its waters and instead developed the Pacific Solution, which involved establishing an offshore detention center on Nauru. In exchange for Nauru's role in preventing immigrants from reaching Australian shores, Australia provided financial compensation to the island nation. This arrangement also had unexpected consequences, such as creating employment opportunities for Nauruans and leading to some peculiar circumstances. Despite the resentment of many Nauruans towards the Pacific Solution, Nauru remained heavily dependent on Australia and unable to turn down the substantial financial incentives offered in exchange for cooperation. Over the last 2 decades, Nauru has periodically provided detention services for Australia and continues to do so today. In conjunction with foreign aid, primarily from Australia, this arrangement has been crucial in sustaining the island's economy. However, it has only done so marginally, and Nauru's financial stability remains precarious. Let's quickly look at the overall numbers. In terms of economic size, Nauru has a GDP of $133 million, making it the third smallest economy globally, with only Montserrat and Tuvalu having smaller economies. This small GDP is distributed across a population of just over 10,000 citizens. As of 2021, Nauru's GDP per capita was $12,000. Unfortunately, Nauru's history of poorly managing its phosphate wealth, as well as its brief stint with unregulated banking and controversial policies of outsourcing detention centers, have negatively affected the country's stability and confidence. Looking back, Nauru enjoyed robust growth in the 1970s and 80s thanks to its phosphate exports, which propelled it to become the wealthiest nation globally. However, when phosphate reserves were depleted in the 1990s, Nauru's GDP plummeted by over 90%. Since then, the economy has rebounded with an average annualized growth rate of 7%. This growth had been primarily driven by the foreign aid and revenue from the detention centers. While the growth is commendable, it is worth noting that its reliance on a narrow range of sources makes the economy vulnerable to external shocks. Currently, Nauru's primary economic activity involves the operation of offshore detention centers for refugees, which generate substantial income for the country. However, this narrow focus on a single industry fails to foster the development of advanced technological capacities required to create more sophisticated industries in the future. If this sole revenue source were to disappear, Nauru would struggle to replace it with a diversified economy. May this be a constant reminder to smaller countries who mainly rely on their natural resources for wealth to be more steadfast with their economies. We wouldn't want to see another pleasant island turn to dust. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, click the like button and subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications to stay updated.